Մեզ հետ է պրոֆեսոր Նյու Յորքի Սուբ Ջոնսի համալսարանի դասախոս Ալեքսանդր Gevorgian-ը, պրոֆեսոր Gevorgian-ը հիմա մեզ հետ է Նյու Յորքից շատ հետաքրքիր պրեզենտացիա է պատրաստել։ Ես կարծում եմ բոլորդ հետաքրքրությամբ կհետևեք, որովհետև շատ հետաքրքիր տվյալներ է հայտնում, նաև հետաքրքիր եզրակացություններ եւ ռեկոմենդացիաներ է անում պարոն Gevorgian-ը։ Խնդրեմ, պարոն Gevorgian.
Okay, I hear we can start, so I'll begin. I'll just continue in English. Hello, everyone. And unfortunately, I have to stay with English as some of the terms I only know as that. Can I share my screen, or do you not want me to? I need permission for that.
Yes, sure. You now need to have it.
Okay, now it's working. So, well, I just introduced myself. I'm Aleksandr Gevorgian. I'm a professor of economics at St. John's University, where I also hold the Henry George Chair in economics. And generally, my interest in research is in the economic history of transition economies, the post-socialist economies, and the smallest ones. So Armenia, Moldova, Georgia, these are my sort of reference points. I also work on international economics, such as exchange rate dynamics, sovereign debt, and somehow got into the conversation on role of diaspora. So in this presentation, you will have a little bit of everything, and it's based on my earlier book on transition economies. So, and with that, let's dive right into it. So as a sort of preface to the story, there's one misconception, and that is that since they were all part of the socialist system, they sort of experienced the same thing and the transition is over. But that's the main question. Is it really over? This chart shows a comparison of average income per capita, to put it in non-technical terms, over several years compared to the level compared to the level in 1990, right? And we can see that for a lot of countries, it took more than 20 years, and some circled in red are still struggling in terms of getting through that sort of reference point, that benchmark, still climbing up. And this is important. It doesn't mean that there are no cell phones or internet connection, but it pretty much tells us that the average living standards have not really improved as significantly as was expected. So this is important for the case of Armenia because I think it helps to understand that the country is not alone in this situation. And it also means that there's a lot to be learned from others. But it doesn't mean replication, it means actually learning, so adaptation. And here we also see that Armenia is doing relatively better compared to some of its other neighbors or other peers. But the problem of averages is that it hides the deeply rooted and hidden socioeconomic inequalities. And that's significant and as part of the presentation that I would like to share with you. When we evaluate the country's progress in general, we should also think in terms of more of a conceptual framework, right? And the simplest form that I could find, which again I argue through describe in my book, is this one. And that's looking at three key pillars of development. First, you have to consider the economic structure, what it is that you're producing, right? What are the competitive advantages and comparative advantages of the economy? This means not as much for the exports, but actually internally. Is the country self-sufficient? Because there are different views. There's export-led view and there's more of a domestic growth view. Second, it is the institutional change, and that's the norms and rules that adopt. But here we fell in generally in the post-socialist region, sort of fell into somewhat of a trap, putting institutions ahead of any practical changes. And this was then later, 20, 30 years later, would be acknowledged by the most active reformers as a mistake. So institutions take time to evolve, to develop, and to actually adapt towards the established economic norms. So economic foundation comes first, in other words. And lastly, it is the social welfare, how people feel and enjoy living in the country. And the one indication of the opposite is when the migration levels are high and we realize there's something wrong. All of these are very dynamic and they move in different sort of directions. But the important part here is to keep this in the background, because there's a lot of attention and comment today in the commentary on micro topics, but this gives us the big picture. Continuing with the big picture, and this is known to the audience, so just very quickly, we also need to remember the environment in which Armenia, Georgia, and similar countries operate in. There are objective sort of uniform shocks, like the pandemic most recently, and then as an outcome from that, the global economic slowdown and then geopolitical tensions. Then there's the whole restructuring of global value chains driven by technological changes, right? The artificial intelligence and all this, they are sort of rebuilding the established patterns of trade, of economic connections, and so on. And then there are more context-specific conflicts, right? So the Artsakh wars, the conflict in Russia-Ukraine, then Central Asia tensions, then there was also tension in Europe, and so on. And added to that are the country-specific problems. So I summarized that a bit later, so I'll skip this. Now, in the case of Armenia, right, the question is about whether growth is sustainable. So we see that it's kind of moving ahead, but do we expect more or less? And the data suggests that quite a bit of the past 2-3 years have been somewhat, well, not necessarily speculative, but driven through the external factors, right? Again, something that is probably obvious. What is interesting in terms of the exports composition is the emphasis on the commodity exports. And here it's not just so much about precious metals, technically could be seen as commodities, but there are other types of commodities, minerals and non-precious metals. And whichever sort of bar chart we'll look at, in one case it's more, in one case it's less, commodities outweigh any of the manufactured goods. Now that is something that speaks to the country's structure and economic foundation, because if the most of the product that is being exported is based just in raw materials, with very little value added, well, we remain in a disadvantage, and the world is full of experiences of developing countries that would remain in this position, and they're defined as commodity-dependent countries, and it's very difficult to break through that. So that requires a significant macroeconomic policy action. Related to sort of the economic growth trends and the pattern in exports is something else. And this point, I think, is very interesting. Since 2020, the world has been tracking depreciation of emerging markets currencies. And as we could see on this chart, for example, anything that's pointing down suggests that the value of the currency of the country is declining, except for 3 cases: Armenia, Georgia, and Tajikistan. In the case of Tajikistan, the appreciation was driven mainly in 2022 by increased labor migration remittances. In the case of Armenia and Georgia, it was certainly due to the relocation of people from Russia, and then corporate relocation and the money that they brought in, but also the increased trade. And expectedly so, in the subsequent years, there was a little bit of a correction, but in the case of Armenia, the correction wasn't really that significant. These lines going up say that the Armenian dram is appreciating, right? Or in this graph, it's shown differently, right? It's how many drams you give up for $1, and the less it is, the stronger is the Armenian dram. Now, the strong currency in itself is not a bad thing necessarily if we have a country that sort of is what I mentioned as self-sufficient, self-sustainable. But in the developing context, a strong currency suggests that imported goods, manufactured goods, become cheaper, right? And the exports, in terms of value added, what I mentioned earlier, remain at a very low level. So practically just agriculture or materials, raw materials. But the inflow of manufactured imports, in fact, pushes out any attempt for, especially at such a significant appreciation of exchange rate, sort of crowds out any attempts to restructure the economy on a systemic level, right? And that's very important because the approach has to be not just one sector specific, but as a system. At least that is my opinion in terms of general development, and Armenia is just one example in that. We see that compared to Georgia as well, Armenia is receiving less in terms of foreign direct investment, as far as net inflows, in terms of absolute numbers, but also in terms of declining trend. And that's also important to keep in mind. In fact, if we look at the central bank's data, the chart, this, well, let me show this. Okay, we see that there's a jump in inflows from Russia, which is, okay, understandably explained, but then it drops, and it drops actually to below 2022 levels. And the same is in the case of inflows from the United States and the rest of the world. If we look at the growth patterns, which are here, the pattern is similar. There's a downward trend. These should all be very serious questions, because if this continues, then the dram's depreciation is going to be even stronger, but it puts more pressure on the central bank to actually protect the currency in this case, and they will have to, because the rest of the system is connected to the current dram's exchange rate. So this is one interesting section, but moving on, we find in the labor market some interesting trends as well. This chart shows changes in wages over the past 4 or so years compared to 2018. So that's the baseline right over here. And we see that there are 3 sectors that really stand out. That's the IT, financial services, and arts and entertainment, but most of this is sort of like gaming business, anything related around that. So wages in those sectors are up. That's probably a good thing. In fact, if we look at number of jobs, that's also growing, especially in the IT sector, so by multiples of 3. So that suggests probably a good thing. The problem is that the benefits of growth of these 3 sectors are not widely distributed, because if we look at the average salaries, this is in drams from the Armstat. If we look at the average salaries across the 3 sectors, we find that even though IT pays the highest, it's not really the greatest employer. It's only 32,000 people working there, compared to education or trade sectors or even manufacturing, whatever there is of that. Right. So that's a significant issue, and this is why I sometimes refer to ICT as the extractive sector, and not to pick on Armenia. Georgia has the same problem. So a lot of the smaller countries, especially in the post-socialist world, are experiencing this. And it's due to a mix of objective reasons, of course, because there's a rise in new technologies, and access to knowledge and education allows people to move up in this. But there are also subjective explanations, and in some cases, the access into the IT sector sort of leads to prospects of employment abroad. And countries that see this growth may experience an outflow of skilled professionals in the medium term, which then further impacts them in a negative way. In the case of Armenia, there's another aspect, and that's the informal employment. Again, these are data from the official sources, right? And according to that, this is from 2022, there was close to 40% of sort of workers in the informal areas, with majority of that being in agriculture. Again, gives a sort of a picture of a pattern of uneven development. Moreover, if we look at the inequalities, we understand regional inequalities, that in terms of wages, but also across the years and across the regions. In this case, Yerevan stands out. In fact, in some of the data that I was looking up for this presentation, I found that actually in both cases, in Yerevan and Tbilisi, almost 60% of economic output is generated in the capital cities. And they also draw up to 30 or more percent of population. So that's quite significant. To add one more point on inequality and poverty, we see that poverty rates are significantly higher in some of the regions compared to Yerevan. And I'm not looking at Sunik because that average is skewed based on the factory, right, and the mining sector there. So that and that's important because this shows actually how just one sector can skew the entire average for the region. So statistics have to be taken very careful with that. One other dimension that clearly is known is the inflow of working age population, that's the Artsakh refugees. And back in 2023, I wrote these 8 points that had to be implemented, right? The obvious is to learn from similar mass relocations, and there have been many where different groups would come in and policies would be designed, provide initial financial support, the resettlement, housing, survival income, which is very similar to basic income ideas in the West. Job guarantees, also a very popular idea in the West that's being discussed. And then resolve banking and financial matters in diaspora. One other important factor to keep in mind is that Armenia is not the main topic of discussions, and not surprisingly. We have a concept known as Global South, and that's a general reference term to talk about developing countries, primarily in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. And almost never, in fact, never, this term would be used to refer to the countries of post-socialist region, especially the small ones. Again, my favorite three: Armenia, Moldova, Georgia. And the opposite to Global South is the term of Global North. But that usually represents the more advanced economies of Europe and North America. So we are stuck in between and nowhere to be found. And with that, sort of my motivation is to have more of Armenian economists to work on these topics and sort of be brave enough to discuss them from the big stage and to explain to the world how the problems of development, in this case in Armenia, are also relevant for the rest of the world, because countries like these type of countries are actually the connector countries that put together, that help the rest of the world connect with each other. So I think that's something that we also have to keep in mind as a big picture. In other words, there should not be an expectation that somehow someone notices the development patterns and economic development patterns in Armenia and reacts to that unless we bring them up, unless we discuss them in an open forum. There's very little in terms of economic policy that could be done. But there are a lot of models. That's important to understand. There are a lot of models of economic development that might be useful and relevant here. Now, in the case of Armenia, inevitably, we must also talk about diaspora. And some time ago, I did some research for the International Organization for Migration Yerevan on the diaspora, with interviews and such, maybe with some people in the room. And to spare the details, the one common trend that was coming up is that diaspora's potential is not fully realized. And everyone has a different definition of what it means to have a diaspora's potential fully realized. For some, it's the entrepreneurial talent. For others, it's the political advocacy. For yet others, it may be cultural engagement and educational and so on. But what's interesting were also the common sort of factors that people would bring up as far as the obstacles, right? And a lot of the interviews pointed to sort of the network system that we have in the diaspora, and the need to engage with the sort of multi-sector professionals across the diaspora. In other words, create engagement infrastructure for the country to be engaged with this. Now, these things are a struggle for a lot of countries that have had successful experiences with their diaspora, from Ireland to China. These are not simple topics, and all of them had to address them in sometimes difficult ways. But again, this is something to keep thinking about, to keep asking questions about, and see what can be done. Last year, I ran a survey, and based on that survey, there are many more questions, but I asked specifically about the economic engagement. And from 500 or more responses, there seems to be an interest in a joint Armenia diaspora investment fund. And that's good, more or less, but the question is very general, so people could not really give a clear preference here, I understand. But what is interesting is the direction of spending, right? And there's clear preference for defense sector spending, education, and high tech. So the high tech has this hold over us, but we just saw in the figures how uneven that development may be. Lastly, on the diaspora, before I conclude the presentation on the diaspora, and I mentioned how difficult it's been for others to capture this potential. We have examples, again, from India, for example, in this case, where we do know about the large Indian diaspora moving back to the country, and from everything from the IT sector to India's attempts with diaspora bonds and such. But apparently, the path was not as even as smooth as we might imagine, right? It really starts with the significance of diaspora network. So what type of professionals get together in the diaspora network and start seeking engagement with the country? Second, it is also important in what environment sort of they grow up both individually, but also professionally. Then how informal they are. So individual connections with the country are informal, but as an institution, let's say an organization engages with a country, that becomes a more formal connection. And actually the sort of the tilt towards formality of engagement is very important, because it establishes a more structured pattern of engagement and connections. And there's a little bit more predictability in this case. And lastly, it's the attitudes within the home country and how open the home country is to diaspora. Now, to summarize all of this, related to Armenia and other small economies, I put together this diagram in hopes that it simplifies what I'm trying to express here. There are obvious risks in economic terms, and when we say that, or rather when I say that, what I have in mind is a risk to sustainability of economic activity, a risk to uninterrupted pattern of development and sort of growth. Obviously, there are geopolitical pressures, there are regional pressures, so that is clear to us. But there's something that I think is extremely important, and that's the macroeconomic and industrial structure. And this is, I would say, is the urgent question to address and to be discussing in the context of every small economy, and in particular case in Armenia. Because if we are, and it is fine if we decide that the ICT, the information technology sector, is the leading sector, then the question is how we structure our policies in a way that that sector also contributes to the rest of the economy and the rest of the population. We saw in the previous charts, it barely employs 1% of labor force, right? Second is the social economic underdevelopment, and that's the whole regional disparity and underdevelopment between the regions. In this case, Armenia follows a pattern of pretty much every developing economy you could think of, where sort of the rural areas are not so affluent, but all of the major, right? So the significant share of economic activity is concentrated in one city, in the capital city. That's a separate topic to sort of discuss, because one could get into the urban economies and how this overburdens the city, but it also creates this unbalanced growth on the scale of an entire country. The third interesting point is the supply chains repositioning. How Armenia as a country connector, right, enters into the global economy. Is it continuing with the raw materials exports, or is it something that is value added? In fact, there have been studies by the World Bank in the past where they would compare Armenia and Georgia, and they would find that most of the sort of whatever there was, most of the value added output from Armenia was actually new, not just for the country, but for the world. So there has been the pattern of significant innovation, and I think this continues, only it needs to be scaled up. So there has to be additional funding that is brought in and integration within the domestic economy, not just for sort of directed towards the outward and export customer. And lastly, is access to foreign exchange. That's where the exchange rate dynamics come in and access to that. So there are 5 options now, but maybe there are more, and I'm happy to maybe discuss that. But I've been talking about these 5 options for a very long time now in different presentations, and I think this is something also to take away in the case of Armenia. How do we move forward? And the first answer is it has to be in a systemic way, some sort of a blueprint where you top down realize a more proactive economy. This would be number 1, right? The big push protectionism, where we are trying to develop either the leading sector or all sectors at the same time. But this would lead towards becoming self-sufficient, but this is also a much demanding task, which requires a significant coordination of sort of intellectual capacity, financial capacity, and business interest. It will be going against so-called markets, but if we still believe that markets self-clear and such, we are very naive, right? So the world experience shows that even free markets need some type of reasonable regulation and some type of guidance. At least that's what Adam Smith thought, but very few people have read Adam Smith, but that's almost a direct quote. The second is to integrate within the existing trading partners, makes sense, but then we could look at examples of, let's say, Poland or Czech Republic, which have integrated with the European Union and are entirely dependent on those economies with very little sort of autonomy in their economic decisions. Third is just to leave things as they are and see what happens. Fourth is try to work with other small economies. And 5 is to continue to rely on diaspora. But even though diaspora has been the source of most of Armenia's foreign direct investment, the challenge with diaspora is the relationship and sustaining of that relationship, so which, it comes and goes, so it's not as reliable. It is an integral, an important component in development, but it's not the 100% sort of soundproof, reliable component. So with that, I think the challenges are great, but I don't want to despair. And I think we have quite a bit to discuss here. So thank you for your attention.
Շնորհակալություն պարոն Գևորգյան, շատ հետաքրքիր եւ շատ կարեւոր պրեզենտացիայի համար։ Ես կխնդրեմ 1-2 շատ կարճ հարց պարոն Գևորգյանին եւ մենք անցնենք մեր մյուս զեկուցողներին։ Սա մեր միակ անգլերեն զեկույցն էր։
Alex, thank you very much, first of all, for very detailed and informative presentation. I have one question. In your presentation, you identified 3 sectors within the Armenian economy which stand out in terms of the wages. What are the mechanisms or policies that can influence even distribution of wages among other sectors as well? Thank you.
Մենք պրեզենտացիայում խոսվեց, որ կան մի 3 ոլորտներ, որտեղ բարձր միջին աշխատավարձ է, չէ՞, եւ ինչ պետք է անել, որպեսզի այդ համահարթեցում տեղի ունենա եւ այդ ազդեցությունը մյուսների վրա նույնպես լինի եւ այնտեղ նույնպես աշխատավարձը բարձրանա, այդ կապը ինչպես ապահովել։
So Thank you for the question. It's actually a very difficult question, whatever steps we implement as a policy, most likely there will be seen as steps that are sort of pressuring those sectors, right, that are going against that, and people will not like that. The only way really is through taxation, and that taxation has to be meaningful. And I'm not saying to raise taxes on IT 100%, but there have to be sort of conditional incentives. At least that's been the case if you look at South Korea. Whatever you'd like to compare Armenia with, whichever successful case, all of the subsidies, all of the support that was provided was always conditional. From China to South Korea to even attempts in Latin America, South America, and this conditionality is based on quality, right? What is being offered as far as a final outcome and competitiveness of the product. So that would be one way. Another way, and how this could be interpreted in regulatory terms is different, because people might say, let's start creating performance reviews, benchmarks and such. Maybe that's also needed. But in fact, there may also be adjustment to living standard, wage indexation. These attempts have been tried. And sort of basically, I think that's what comes to mind right now. Taxation, wage indexation, the conditional support, subsidies, and such. But I think one of the reasons why there's this also wage discrepancy is because of high concentration of sort of professionals, right, within one sector, because that is the highest wage earning sector. There may also be other benefits that attract people into that sector. And I can think of examples here in, let's say, on Wall Street. All of a sudden, maybe 10, 15 years ago, the banking system was no longer was able to hire as many professionals as they could, even though they were offering higher competitive wages. A lot of people were going into the tech sector. And it turned out what was different were the working conditions, the benefits, such as, again, in the United States, people need to have a job to have a proper health insurance, right? It's slightly different in Armenia, but still matters, I believe. So these type of things, other benefits that could be added to other sectors, especially if it's within the capacity of the state, that may attract more professionals and actually push more productivity, and with productivity, higher wages.
Thanks for the question. Thank you, Alec. In 2 words, let me translate it into Armenian. Իմ հարցին, որը թարգմանեց Ստեփանը, շատ կարճ հակիրճ ասեմ, որ պատասխանը հետևյալն էր. Տարբեր մեթոդներ կա ազդելու այդ 3 ոլորտի վրա, որտեղ աշխատավարձները շատ բարձր են. Դրանցից մեկը եւ կարևորը հարկերն են, հարկային պոլիտիկան, երկրորդը պետության միջնորդությունը, ասենք բարելավելու պայմանները տարբեր սեկտորներում եւ այլն։ Կարճ ասած դա, շնորհակալություն։